Imagine a commander who designed what many consider the greatest military triumph of the 20th century. A man who received a field marshal's baton directly from Hitler, and whose campaigns are still examined in military academies as examples of operational brilliance. Now picture that same commander stopping just 30 miles away from 290,000 of his own troops who were trapped, starving, and freezing inside the Stalingrad pocket. He did not stop because fuel was exhausted. He did not stop because his force had been destroyed. He stopped because he judged the danger too high. Only 30 miles stood between him and 290,000 soldiers. Those men could hear the sound of his artillery across the frozen landscape. They believed rescue was approaching. Yet he turned back. His name was Erich von Manstein. This is the story of a man capable of helping bring down France in 6 weeks, yet unable to cover the final 30 miles that might have saved an army. Erich von Manstein was born Fritz Erich Georg Eduard von Lewinsky on the 24th of November, 1887 in Berlin. He entered a family so closely connected to Germany's military establishment that his future seemed determined before he could understand the concept of choice. He was the 10th child of a Prussian artillery general. In Germany during the late 19th century, that meant growing up in an environment where military service was not viewed as a profession, but as a normal part of life. The traditions of the Prussian officer class were passed down with the same certainty as family customs and religious practices. Soon after birth, he was adopted by his mother's sister and her husband, Georg von Manstein, another Prussian general. He took the family name that history would later remember. At 12 years old, he entered military training as a cadet. A different path was never seriously considered because, in the world around him, few alternatives appeared worthy of consideration. During the First World War, he served as a young officer on both the Eastern and Western fronts. He was wounded in 1914 and emerged from the conflict possessing both battlefield experience and advanced military education, a combination that shaped the remainder of his career. When the Treaty of Versailles limited Germany to a 100,000-man army, he was among the officers retained. Throughout the years between the wars, he devoted himself to developing concepts of armored warfare and operational maneuver that would later make his reputation known worldwide. He was the ideal staff officer. His thinking extended beyond individual engagements. He examined entire theaters of war and understood not only the next battle, but the chain of actions and decisions that would influence events weeks or months later. Such a talent was uncommon, and Germany possessed it at a moment when it proved especially valuable. The plan that eventually brought Manstein fame, the operation that shattered France during the summer of 1940 and astonished much of the world, including many German commanders, was not entirely his invention from the beginning. Yet in every practical sense, it became his plan. Germany's initial concept for invading France closely resembled a revised Schlieffen plan. The attack would move through Belgium, precisely where French planners expected it to go. France had prepared carefully for that possibility and positioned its strongest formations accordingly. Manstein examined the proposal and concluded that it would fail. He believed French and British forces would meet the German advance in Belgium, creating a prolonged struggle of attrition that Germany lacked the economic and industrial capacity to win. Instead, he proposed a thrust through the Ardennes forest. Contemporary military doctrine considered the region unsuitable for armored operations, and the French therefore left it largely unprotected. The plan called for German forces to break through the forest, reach the English Channel, and sever the Allied armies in Belgium from their rear areas. Such a move would render the entire Allied defensive position unsustainable. His superiors repeatedly dismissed the proposal. They viewed it as excessively risky. Success depended on armored forces moving through terrain many believed impossible. If any stage failed, the consequences could be severe. Manstein continued advocating for the concept with remarkable persistence. That determination did not endear him to the military hierarchy, but it occasionally produced outcomes that justified the frustration it caused. Eventually, he was transferred away from Army Group A headquarters, in part because senior officers wished to remove both him and his troublesome proposal. Before departing, however, he arranged for the plan to reach Hitler personally. Hitler possessed an attraction to bold and unconventional ideas. At times, this instinct served him exceptionally well. At other moments, it led directly to disaster. Upon hearing Manstein's proposal, Hitler immediately recognized its potential and ordered its adoption despite resistance from the Army High Command. The result was the collapse of France in 6 weeks during the summer of 1940. The British Army evacuated from Dunkirk, and France signed an armistice in the very railway carriage where Germany had accepted defeat in 1918. The symbolism was almost unbelievable in its precision. It was the most dramatic military victory in modern European history, and Manstein's vision stood at its center. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Manstein commanded a panzer corps that advanced rapidly through the Baltic region during the opening phase of the campaign. His forces moved forward at a speed that exceeded even optimistic German expectations. Later, he received command of the 11th Army in Crimea and was assigned the task of capturing Sevastopol, the heavily fortified stronghold at the southern end of the Crimean Peninsula. For years, Soviet defenses there had been strengthened to such an extent that many military observers considered the city virtually impossible to take. Manstein conducted a siege lasting 8 months. He assembled the largest artillery pieces available to Germany, including the enormous railway gun known as Dora. The weapon fired shells weighing 7 tons and required more than 1,000 personnel simply to make it operational. In July 1942, Sevastopol finally fell. The victory reflected both Manstein's patience and his skill in coordinating large-scale combined arms operations over an extended period. Hitler promoted him to field marshal on the day the city was captured, making him the youngest field marshal in the German army. Whatever judgments history would later make, the promotion reflected a genuine military accomplishment. By any reasonable standard, the capture of Sevastopol ranked among the war's major achievements, yet Stalingrad would become the event most closely associated with his legacy. In November 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus. The offensive encircled the German 6th Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus within the ruins of Stalingrad. The operation unfolded with astonishing speed and effectiveness, catching the German leadership unprepared. 290,000 men found themselves trapped. Temperatures fell to minus 40 degrees. Supplies diminished rapidly. Without relief, survival became increasingly unlikely. The Soviet ring around the city strengthened with each passing day, while conditions inside the pocket deteriorated. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout. He insisted Stalingrad must be held. Personal prestige had overtaken military logic. Paulus obeyed because obedience to Hitler remained the norm among German generals in 1942, even when the consequences were obvious. Manstein received command of the newly formed Army Group Dawn and was ordered to rescue the encircled force. The mission appeared straightforward on paper. In reality, it was anything but simple. Operation Winter Storm began in December 1942. Its principal striking force was the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Holth. The relief column advanced northeast towards Stalingrad through brutal winter weather while encountering determined Soviet resistance at every stage. By the 19th of December, the leading elements had reached the Mishkova River, approximately 30 miles from the perimeter of the pocket. The trapped soldiers could hear the distant guns of the approaching force through the frozen air. For weeks, they had been told relief was coming. Now, for the first time, they had evidence. Manstein understood that Paulus needed to move outward and link up with the relief force. The 6th Army lacked sufficient fuel and strength to remain stationary while the rescue operation fought through the Inédit. What came after Stalingrad was, in many respects, Manstein's most impressive achievement, strictly from a military standpoint. That fact alone reveals the unusual contradiction at the center of his career. During February and March of 1943, the German Southern Front was collapsing under relentless Soviet pressure. Following the victory at Stalingrad, Red Army formations pushed far into Ukraine, advancing with growing momentum. In response, Manstein carried out an operation later known as the backhand blow. He allowed Soviet units to continue moving forward until their supply network was stretched close to its limit. Then he struck. Concentrated armored formations attacked exposed flanks, regained Kharkov, and restored stability across the entire southern sector. Military historians have consistently regarded the operation as one of the finest demonstrations of operational warfare ever conducted. He had overseen the worst German defeat of the war. Soon afterward, he directed one of Germany's greatest battlefield successes. Whether that reflects exceptional professional resilience or demonstrates that military brilliance and moral judgment are entirely different qualities is a matter left to history. At Kursk in July 1943, Manstein commanded Army Group South during the German offensive. After Allied forces landed in Sicily and Hitler ordered the operation halted, Manstein strongly opposed the decision. He believed the attack still possessed a realistic chance of success if pursued with full determination. In his view, stopping the offensive represented a strategic error of the highest magnitude and would permanently surrender the initiative to the Soviet Union. Many believe he may have been correct, although historians continue debating the question without reaching a final conclusion. Throughout the remainder of 1943 and into 1944, he directed a fighting withdrawal across Ukraine. The Soviet army grew stronger and more confident with each passing month. Again and again, Manstein demonstrated an ability to restore order in situations that appeared beyond recovery, buying time that Germany rarely used as effectively as he wished. His disagreements with Hitler became increasingly frequent. Manstein favored flexible defensive methods, elastic responses, and freedom of maneuver. These ideas had defined his military philosophy for years. Hitler demanded something entirely different. As Germany's position worsened, he insisted more aggressively on holding every position, regardless of circumstances. The conflict between the two men became unavoidable. In March 1944, Hitler removed Manstein from command. He would never again lead troops during the remainder of the war. Following Germany's defeat, he faced trial before a British military tribunal on charges involving war crimes. The case focused on actions carried out by forces operating within his area of command in the Soviet Union. Among the accusations were failures to prevent the killing of Jews and Soviet prisoners of war by Einsatzgruppen units active in the regions controlled by his headquarters. The court found him guilty and imposed a sentence of 18 years imprisonment. Several senior British and German officers organized financial support for his defense. They argued that he had been a professional military commander and had been punished for crimes committed by political organizations operating alongside his forces, rather than under his direct authority. In 1953, after serving less than 4 years, he was released because of poor health. Given the original sentence, the decision was interpreted in different ways. Some viewed it as recognition of the complexities surrounding command responsibility in modern warfare. Others saw it as evidence that victorious nations treated German army officers differently from members of the SS when political circumstances made such distinctions useful. In 1955, he published his memoirs under the title Lost Victories. The book presented his military career in the most favorable manner, supported by available evidence. It highlighted his strategic accomplishments and emphasized his disagreements with Hitler. Questions regarding responsibility for actions carried out under his command were addressed with careful wording and deliberate ambiguity, reflecting the precision of a highly experienced staff officer. Lost Victories became one of the most widely read military memoirs produced after the war. Its influence on public understanding of the German army's role in the conflict was enormous. It was likely the most significant work Manstein ever wrote, and almost certainly the one crafted with the greatest care. During the rearmament of West Germany in the 1950s, he served as an advisor to the government and contributed to the development of the new Bundeswehr. He provided expertise to the military establishment of the same nation that had prosecuted and imprisoned him, approaching the assignment with the same professional dedication that characterized the rest of his career. Manstein died on the 9th of June, 1973, at the age of 85. By then, he had outlived most of the men of his generation and spent his final decades as a respected yet highly controversial figure within West German military circles. The evidence supporting Manstein's military talent is extensive. Friends, opponents, and neutral observers across 8 decades of historical study have acknowledged his exceptional ability. At the same time, he served a criminal regime with professional commitment. Forces operating under his authority committed or failed to prevent grave crimes against civilians and prisoners throughout the Eastern Front. He was also the commander who stopped 30 miles from 290,000 of his own soldiers and chose not to continue. For the next 30 years of his life, he explained that decision in careful, professionally reasoned terms, arguing that military realities left no better alternative. History has never fully resolved whether he was correct. It may never do so. But the men who entered Soviet captivity after the fall of Stalingrad and never returned home are not part of that discussion. That is the story of Erich von Manstein, Hitler's most celebrated field commander, the man who chose not to share the fate of the army he failed to reach. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Erich von Manstein led a panzer corps that advanced rapidly through the Baltic states during the opening phase of the campaign. His formations moved forward at a rate that exceeded even the expectations of Germany's most optimistic planners. Later, he was assigned command of the 11th Army in Crimea. His mission was the capture of Sevastopol, the massive fortress city located at the end of the Crimean Peninsula. Over many years, Soviet authorities had transformed the position into one of the most heavily defended strongholds in the region. Many military experts considered it virtually impossible to conquer. Manstein began a siege that lasted 8 months. To break the defenses, he assembled some of the largest artillery weapons available to Germany. Among them was the enormous railway cannon known as Dora. The gun fired shells weighing 7 tons and required a crew exceeding 1,000 men before it could even be placed into service. In July 1942, Sevastopol finally fell. The campaign highlighted both Manstein's disciplined approach and his ability to coordinate complicated combined arms operations over a prolonged period. On the day of the victory, Hitler promoted him to field marshal. The appointment made him the youngest field marshal in the German army. Whatever conclusions history may draw about Manstein, the achievement at Sevastopol represented a military success of the highest level by any reasonable measure. Yet the event that would define his reputation was still ahead. That event was Stalingrad. More than any victory before it or any operation afterward, Stalingrad became the standard by which history would judge him. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus. The offensive surrounded the German 6th Army commanded by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. The encirclement unfolded with remarkable speed and efficiency, catching the German high command completely by surprise. Inside the pocket were 290,000 men. Temperatures fell to minus 40 degrees. Supplies became increasingly scarce. Without immediate relief, survival appeared unlikely. The Soviet ring around the city expanded and strengthened day after day, while the troops trapped inside steadily weakened. Hitler refused to authorize a withdrawal. He insisted that Stalingrad must remain in German hands. By that point, personal prestige had replaced practical military judgment. Paulus complied. In 1942, German generals generally followed Hitler's orders, even when they fully understood the consequences. Manstein received command of the newly formed Army Group Dawn and was ordered to rescue the encircled force. The mission appeared simple on paper. Reality was very different. Operation Winter Storm began in December 1942. The offensive centered on the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth. Moving northeast toward Stalingrad, the relief force battled severe winter conditions and determined Soviet resistance that contested every mile of progress. By the 19th of December, the advancing formations had reached the Mishkova River. They stood approximately 30 miles from the Stalingrad perimeter. The distance was short enough that soldiers trapped inside the pocket could hear the guns of the approaching force through the frozen air. After weeks of promises that rescue was coming, they finally had proof. Manstein understood that Paulus needed to move outward and meet the advancing troops. The 6th Army lacked both the fuel and strength required to remain stationary while relief forces fought through the entire Soviet encirclement. To signal the moment, Manstein transmitted the code word thunderclap. The message authorized a breakout. Paulus refused to act without a direct order from Hitler. Hitler refused to issue one. Leaving Stalingrad meant surrendering Stalingrad, and that was a decision Hitler could not bring himself to approve regardless of military reality. At that moment, Manstein's armored spearheads were only 30 miles away from 290,000 German soldiers waiting for rescue. He chose to stop. The advance was halted. His forces began withdrawing to avoid becoming surrounded themselves. His explanation rested on military logic. Soviet attacks against the flanks of the relief corridor were genuine. The possibility of the rescue force becoming trapped was real. Without a simultaneous breakout by the 6th Army, the operation faced enormous obstacles no matter how far the tanks advanced. These concerns were not imaginary. Any capable commander would have been forced to evaluate the same dangers. Yet many soldiers inside the pocket believed otherwise. For decades, numerous military historians have argued that continued pressure from the outside might have altered the outcome. 30 miles remained. Some believed determined men facing desperate circumstances could have crossed that distance if the relieving force had continued pushing forward. According to that interpretation, Germany's most celebrated commander reached the decisive moment of the war, assessed the risks, judged them unacceptable, and selected the militarily defensible option instead of the one desperation demanded. The 6th Army surrendered in February 1943. Months of hunger, freezing weather, and constant suffering ended among the ruins of a city Hitler considered more valuable than the lives of the men defending it. Out of the 290,000 soldiers trapped inside the encirclement, 90,000 survivors entered Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 eventually returned to Germany alive. What followed Stalingrad became, in many ways, Manstein's greatest accomplishment as an operational commander. In February and March of 1943, Soviet victories had pushed German forces across the southern front into crisis. Red Army formations surged deep into Ukraine following the success at Stalingrad. Manstein responded with an operation later known as the backhand blow. He permitted Soviet armies to continue advancing until their supply systems were stretched close to collapse. Then he launched concentrated armored attacks against their exposed flanks. The counterstroke retook Kharkov and restored stability to the southern front. Military historians continue to regard the operation as one of the finest demonstrations of operational warfare ever executed. Only weeks after Germany's worst defeat of the war, Manstein directed one of its most impressive victories. At Kursk in July 1943, he commanded Army Group South during the German offensive. When Allied landings in Sicily prompted Hitler to terminate the operation, Manstein strongly argued for continuing the attack. He believed success remained possible if the offensive received full commitment. In his view, stopping the battle represented a strategic mistake of the highest order and would permanently hand the initiative to the Soviet Union. Many historians continue debating the issue, and no final consensus has emerged. Throughout the remainder of 1943 and into 1944, Manstein conducted a fighting withdrawal across Ukraine. As Soviet forces grew stronger and more confident, he repeatedly demonstrated an ability to restore order in situations that appeared beyond recovery, gaining time that Germany rarely used as effectively as he hoped. His disputes with Hitler became increasingly frequent. Manstein favored maneuver, flexibility, and elastic defense. Hitler demanded rigid resistance in the defense of every position. As Germany's military situation worsened, the disagreement deepened. In March 1944, Hitler dismissed him from command. He would never command another military formation during the war. After the conflict ended, a British military tribunal charged him with war crimes connected to actions carried out by forces operating within his area of command in the Soviet Union. Among the accusations was the failure to prevent the killing of Jews and Soviet prisoners of war by Einsatzgruppen units active in the territories under his authority. He was found guilty. The sentence imposed was 18 years in prison. Several senior British and German officers contributed funds for his legal defense. They argued that he was a professional military officer who had been held responsible for actions committed by political organizations operating alongside his forces rather than directly beneath his command structure. In 1953, after serving less than 4 years, he was released because of poor health. In 1955, he published his memoirs, Lost Victories. The book portrayed his career in the most favorable manner possible within the limits of available evidence. It emphasized military achievements and highlighted disagreements with Hitler. Questions regarding responsibility for events under his command were addressed with carefully chosen language and deliberate caution. Lost Victories became one of the most widely read military memoirs connected to the war. Its influence shaped how an entire generation viewed the role of the German army during the conflict. During the rearmament of West Germany in the 1950s, Manstein served as an advisor to the government and helped develop the structure of the new Bundeswehr. He contributed his expertise with the same professional dedication that had characterized every stage of his military career. On the 9th of June, 1973, Erich von Manstein died at the age of 85. He had outlived many of his contemporaries and spent his final years as a respected, yet deeply controversial figure within West German military circles. The evidence supporting his military ability remains extensive. Friends, enemies, and independent observers have recognized that ability across decades of historical research. At the same time, he served a criminal regime and commanded forces that committed or failed to prevent severe crimes against civilians and prisoners throughout the Eastern Front. He was also the commander who stopped 30 miles away from 290,000 of his own men and turned back. For the final 30 years of his life, he defended that decision with carefully reasoned military arguments. Whether history ultimately accepts those arguments remains unresolved. It may remain unresolved forever. The men who entered Soviet captivity after the fall of Stalingrad and never returned home, however, will never take part in that discussion. That was the story of Erich von Manstein, Hitler's most renowned. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.